Two Palestinian protesters were shot dead by Israeli forces on Tuesday during anti-occupation rallies on the Gaza border with Israel. 59 were killed on Monday in protests against the relocation of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. The UN Security Council, which held a special meeting on the matter, condemned the killing. But not all members seemed willing to work on measures to end the violence.
The silence of this council since the beginning of the crisis is becoming less and less understandable.
The vacuum in constructive international efforts, as was shown by recent events, is very dangerous.
We urge the parties concerned to stop the violence and abusive use of force, and in particular to stop actions that target civilians. The use of violence and force will not bring security to anyone.
We need to look forward and we need to work urgently towards the resolution of the long-standing issues between Israel and the Palestinian people. Like this Council, the United Kingdom is committed to a two-state solution with Jerusalem as a shared capital and to achieving peace and stability in the wider region.
The United States deplores the loss of human life. But there is a lot of violence throughout the region, and I will note that the double standard is all too common in this chamber and working overtime today. Those who suggest that the Gaza violence has anything to do with the location of the American embassy are sorely mistaken.
However, as Caleb Maupin now explains, Nikki Haley's accusations may be a double-edged sword.
The day that the American embassy was officially moved to Jerusalem was a day of great jubilation for American and Israeli officials.
What a glorious day. Remember this moment.
But across the Palestinian territories, it couldn't have been more different. In beleaguered Gaza, there was nothing but suffering and chaos.
Our greatest hope is for peace.
The United States is prepared to support peace negotiations.
The United States is prepared to support a peace agreement in every way that we can.
I don't think it hurts the peace plan. The peace plan will be introduced at the appropriate time.
There was certainly not any criticism of any of Israel's extreme use of force by anyone in the Trump administration.
Hamas terrorists, backed by Iran, have incited attacks against Israeli security forces and infrastructure.
So Israel is not responsible for shooting Palestinian protesters, some of whom were just children, shot down by their own soldiers? But if you replace Israel with Syria, suddenly Nikki Haley's heart bleeds for the dead in far less clear-cut situations.
Yesterday morning, we awoke to pictures, to children being carried in the arms of desperate parents.
Yes, all the talk about human rights does not apply to Palestinian protesters. They do not get America's support because they're not protesting in the right country.
Big protests in Iran. The people are finally getting wise as to how their money and wealth is being stolen and squandered on terrorism. Looks like they will not take it any longer. The USA is watching very closely for human rights violations.
With Israel, all bets are off. On World Press Freedom Day, Heather Nauert was all about championing the rights of journalists. That is, until somebody mentioned Gaza.
We see all too often that journalists continue to take great risks to pursue this important work.
Would you also condemn the recent deaths of journalists, Palestinian journalists in the Gaza Strip?
Look, there are unfortunately a lot of journalists who die all around the world. I'm not going to be able to list every single death of a journalist, and we understand that Israel has a right to defend itself.
Back in April, Yasser Mutaja, a Palestinian photojournalist who was wearing a jacket clearly marked press, was shot by an Israeli sniper. Now, if this was intentional, it could possibly constitute a war crime by Israel. But Heather Nauert thinks it was self-defense. Either way, she doesn't have time to talk about every journalist who's been killed. And apparently his death doesn't fit in with Washington's agenda. Caleb Maupin, RT, New York.
Israeli security forces have insisted they acted in self-defense against Palestinian protesters as violence intensified on the borders of disputed territories there. Israel also said that 53 tons of medical equipment had been transferred to Gaza this week. However, a representative from the medical charity group Doctors Without Borders insists the medical system can't cope and is on the verge of collapse.
There was more than 1,300 gunshot injuries for Gaza, and MSF was present in 3 hospitals in Gaza in support of the Ministry of Health. And to give you an example, in Al-Aqsa Hospital, in less than 4 hours, there was more than 300 injured people. The health system, since many months, since many years, they were already on the verge of collapse. There is only 4 hours of electricity in Gaza. The people are not paid or partially paid. There is a shortage of drugs, of disposable. So the medical staff were struggling since many months in order to give a quality of care for the patients.
After the recent spike in violence in Gaza, rallies in support of Palestinians have been held in several cities across the world. In London, Brussels and Athens, crowds waved Palestinian flags and called on Israel to stop the oppression against protesters. Meanwhile, the US president has congratulated the Muslim world as it begins to observe the holy month of Ramadan. Donald Trump called it a time for reflection and spiritual growth. But Middle East analyst Moshe Al-Farah believes his words are insincere.
I think it's a message of hollow words, because it means nothing when we see Donald Trump's actions. So we see it as really hollow and just an attempt to, if you like, beautify the ugly stance that he took against Muslims and against Arabs and Palestinians in particular. The United States of America is blindly supporting the Israeli state, no matter what. 42 United Nations Security Council resolutions against Israel, and nothing is done because of the American pressure. Nothing, none whatsoever, not even. We're not asking for them to destroy Israel. We're asking for them to impose pressure on Israel so that they can abide by the United Nations resolution, international law. We need deeds, not words, and these are hollow words.
Relocating the US Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem was one of Trump's election campaign pledges. And it's not the only controversial promise he's kept, as RT's Donald Corter explains.
Promises. Politicians make them and break them. Trump has something of a reputation for at least making good on some of his.
President Trump's decision tonight is yet another example of Donald Trump keeping promises to you, the American people.
So President Trump is keeping his promise to make America safe again.
President Trump keeping his promise made in America Week starting today.
So let's give the guy credit where credit is due. But here are 5 times Trump should have perhaps parked those pledges. First up, vowing to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
We will move the American embassy to the eternal capital of the Jewish people, Jerusalem.
While the Israeli PM proclaimed it a day of peace, deadly protests raged elsewhere. Dozens dead and over 2,000 injured, including children. Next up, bailing on the Iran nuclear deal. Trump's always been pretty clear about what he'd do when he got the keys to the White House.
My #1 priority is to dismantle the disastrous deal with Iran.
Yeah, scrapping the deal and a slew of new sanctions. Trump expected others to follow, but what he got was a multinational shaking of heads. Leaders who voiced regret said they were deeply concerned and called it an unfortunate step.
The nuclear deal is not a bilateral agreement, and it is not in the hands of any single country to terminate it unilaterally.
Europe's not happy, and Americans probably won't be so happy about the next thing on Trump's checklist either, vowing to boost the military budget.
As soon as I take office, I will ask Congress to fully eliminate the defense sequester and will submit a new budget to rebuild our military.
The commander-in-chief has already secured a $61 billion increase for 2018. Taxpayers also might like to know how that will send the 2020 deficit to about, I don't know, $1 trillion. But that won't stand in the way of Trump's promise to storm off from the Paris Climate Accord.
We're going to rescind all the job-destroying Obama executive actions. Including the Climate Action Plan.
Sure, he kept his word. But this time, the rest of the world just shrugged its shoulders, gave a collective meh, and is carrying on without him. Finally, let's not forget that White House 180 when Trump took over from Barack Obama and vowed to keep America's notorious terror suspect prison open for business.
I watched President Obama talking about Gitmo, right? Guantanamo Bay, which by the way, we are keeping open. And we're going to load it up with some bad dudes, believe me, we're going to load it up.
No surprises there. What's more, Trump is a bit of a fan of the waterboarding interrogation technique, even if the UN says it's torture. In fact, he's so sold on it, he's lined up a CIA pic infamously linked to torture methods. But Gina Haspel is so controversial that police have twice had to remove protesters from her Senate hearing for the job. So, the Don's being good on his word. Fair enough. But perhaps the world might be a calmer place if he just occasionally let a few promises slide, you know, like the others do. Donald Corder, RT.